This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi Glatstein. Baruch Mabam to the Kol Igor the Perka here in Kew Garden Hills, New York. So, this is our second to last year before Shavuos, Haba Aleinu L'Taiva. So we want to speak about the Aseret HaDibros and the various customs of reading the Aseret HaDibros. There's a Mishnah in Masechta Tamid. If you remember, back in the good old days, we actually learned Masechta Tamid together one summer. In the fifth parak, the first Mishnah said that in the Beis HaMikdash, Amar Lohem HaMamuneh, the Veker, the appointed one, would say to them early in the morning, Barchu Baracha Achas, make one bracha. Vehein Berchu, and they made a bracha. Karu Aseres Hadvarim, they read the Aseres Hadibros, Shema, V'hayim Shamaya, V'hayomer. They would then bless three blessings, Emes V'yatzav, Ritzei, and Brachas Kayanim. Very interestingly, the Mishnah is telling us that in the Beis HaMikdash, in middle of the Brachas Kriya Shema, they would recite not only the Shema and the Brachos, they would add the Aseres Hadibros. Now, obviously, this is not something that we do, but in fact, obviously, it was not a hefsek. It was considered part of the halacha. It was mandated. In fact, the Gemara in Masechta Brachos comments on this Mishnah, number 2, V'koirin Aseres Hadibros Shema V'hayim Shamaya V'hayomer Emes V'yatzav V'hadibros Kohanim Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel Af Bigvulin Bigshu L'krois Kain. They even wanted to do this Bigvulin. They even wanted to do this outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So why did they stop? Ela Shekvar Bitlum, but they abolished the practice, and we'll see, Rav Moshe writes in a Tshuva, the language of Bitlum implies that they actually did do it Bigvulin, they actually did do it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and they had to stop. Why? Mibnei Tarumas Haminim, because of the complaints of the Apikarsim. Tanya Nami Hachi, Rav Nasan Omer, Bigvulin Bigshu L'krois Kain, Ela Shekvar Bitlum, Mibnei Tarumas Haminim. Rabbi Bar Chana Savar L'Mikveinu B'Surah. Rabbi Bar Chana wanted to enact this in Surah. So they told him, Amalei Rav Chizda, Kfar Bidlam, Mnei Tarumas Haminim, Amei Marcel Lagvil Ben Arda, Amalei Rav Ashi, Kfar Bidlam, Mnei Tarumas Haminim. So apparently there was a lot of reason, and there were ta'amim, there were logics to try to institute saying the Aseres HaDibros B'chol Yom, and they pointed out that they were mevatel this because of the complaints of the minim. What are these complaints? It's a very interesting Rashi. It says Rashi, Shelo Yoimru La'amei Haaretz, so that they don't say to the Amei Haaretz. Now, typically, who are minim? Typically, minim are Jewish apostates, Jewish apikarsim. A goy is not a min. A goy is a goy. Not easy to be a goy. You have to be, your mother has to be a goy. You can't just be a goy. But a min is much easier to be. So, what? Okay. Rashi here teaches min akum, which is usually not what min means. You look in the Noda B'Yehuda points out that this is different than all other minim. Here, minim refer to goyim, and we're afraid they're going to say to the Amei Haaretz, what? Ein shar Torah emes. The rest of the Torah is not true. V'teidu, the proof is, she'en karin ela ma she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'shama mipiv b'Sinai. The proof is in the pudding. The proof is you only read the Aseres HaDibros. You're not reading anything else. So it must be the Goyim, we're afraid the Goyim are going to tell the Amei Haaretz, come on, the only real Torah are the Aseres HaDibros. By the way, the Yerushalmi says it straight out. The Yerushalmi in Brachos, Parak Aleph, Halacha, Hey, says, Rav Maser, Rav Shmuel Bar Nachman, Rav Amrin, B'din hoyosh yu koirin Aseres HaDibros b'chol yom. Really, we should be reading, laning Aseres HaDibros every day. So why not? B'nei tainas haminim shlo yu oimrim elu levadan nitnu loy l'moshe b'Sinai. Okay, very interesting. So the question arises, as part of Shachris, besides the Berachos HaShachar and the Psukei de Zimra, there are many other things that we read from the Torah. Many people have a custom. They say the Akedah, the Parshas Haman, the Parshas Ha'olah, the Parshas HaMincha. What about the Aseres HaDibros? Are you allowed to say the Aseres HaDibros b'tzibur? So there's a tshuva in the Rashba, Chelik Aleph, Siman Kuf Pei Daled. Says the Rashba, Aser la'asos kain. You may not recite the Aseres HaDibros b'tzibur. You don't, not even without a Sefer Torah. You cannot say it b'tzibur. Why? the same way the Mishnah says in Talmud, they would say the Aseres HaDibros in the Beis HaMikdash, and they wanted to do it b'gvulin, and they were mavato mimnei tarumas haminim. So too, you cannot, between Berchas HaShachar and Pesukei de Zimra, right before Rabbi Shmuel Omer, say together the Aseres HaDibros. It falls under the umbrella gezerah of Shelo Yoimru Elu Levadai Nitnu L'Moshe B'Sinai. And it's codified in the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Aleph, Sif Hey. The Mechaber says all the way in the beginning. Okay, so even if you just got that far, Siman Aleph. Toiv Loimar Parshas Ho'akeda, U'Parshas Haman, V'Aseres HaDibros. It's a good thing to say these things. I would add it's a good thing to come to shul in the morning. It's also, good thing to daven Bizmanoi. And on top of that, it's also good to say the Akeda and the Man and the Aseres HaDibros. It says Ramah, V'dafka b'yachid. Aval Asur la'amram b'tzibur. You're now to say it b'tzibur. Who says? Teshuvas HaRashba. Comes the Mishnah Berurah, and the Mishnah Berurah comments, why you know how to say it b'tzibur? Because of the Kaifrim who say Ein Torah Lazu. Especially our days, we are those Ameha, the Minim, they're rampant, they're everywhere. There's swarms of them. They're all over the place. Therefore, okay, let me just check one thing first. Is there?
Up there.
Where? Oh yeah. So therefore, it says in Mishnah Berurah, therefore, ein koisenoisai gamken al kunshus hamyuchad l'tzibur. You're now to write it on a plaque, which is designated for the tzibur. Despite the fact that almost every shul does it, but you're not allowed to. It says in Mishnah Berurah, l'kach ein koisenoisai gamken al kunshus hamyuchad l'tzibur. We'll have to see. Yeah, I mean, what is that? That's not the Declaration of Independence. That's a Aseres HaDibros. Now, why not? The Mishnah Berurah seems to be extending the gezerah of the Gemara. The Gemara says, you're not a lein it b'tzibur, lest somebody say, this is the only Torah, so you can't have it publicly displayed. Why? So that people don't say, this is the only part of the Torah. After all, why aren't you displaying also that? And Eila Todos Nayach Ish Sadik. Because we're afraid that people are going to say, Elu Levadai Nitnu L'Moshe B'Sinai. By the way, this comes from the Magen Avram. Mibnei Haminim Sha'imrim Ein Torah Elazu. Especially in our days. Maybe it could be in Kugarn Hills. There are no Minim, so you don't have to worry. But that's the Ikar Hadin that the Mishnah Berurah says. We'll come back to this topic. Again, I don't mean to, every shul follows their Marad Asra, but this is what the Mishnah Berurah seems to be saying. And then the Mishnah Berurah says like this: it's only usher to say it b'tzibur by Birchas Kriyas Shema. But before Birchas Kriyas Shema, before Baal Shamar, you're allowed to say it b'tzibur. But no, says Mishnah Berurah, we paskin, you're not allowed to say it b'tzibur at all, even not toichat tefillah. By the way, regarding this issue of publicly displaying the Aseres HaDibros, there's a tshuva, and Shas Teshuvas Churas Shai. Im kasher hadavar lichtoi v'Aseres HaDibros b'koisel beis hakneses. On the inside, on the outside. Well, it says the Shurashai, in my opinion, it's Asar. Why? Because if they were Mavato reading the Aseres HaDibros, because of the Minim, who we're afraid are going to say, Ein Torah Elazu, as the Magen Avram says, therefore you cannot write it on a plaque for the Tzibur. And says the Shurashai, in my opinion, it's a Kavachomer. Because to lane it, or to say it b'tzibur, fine, so it takes, 1 minute, and then the rest of the day, nobody's paying attention. But to publicly display the Aseres HaDibros, that it stands openly, b'fnei kolam ba'ida, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, of course it's asar. And therefore,
So we're saying this.
well, what's the nafkamina? Kuntris or a plaque? Kuntris is... Yeah, so certainly if you can't write it on a tzetel and put it on the wall, to have it on a stone and it permanently displayed, it would seem to be the same thing. There's a shul. I heard that they write it on the Koisley Beis HaMedrash in a certain location. He said, who said they ever asked the rabbi? They did it. The Balabatim did it. Shaloi B'Ratzon Chazal, V'Chachmei Adoros, says the Churashai, don't follow them. It could be they taka wrote it because they're apikarsim, and that's what they wanted to show. Ve'ein lahashkiach b'ma shenimtza be'ez hakneses. We don't follow what people do. We follow the halacha. You'll see initial they do that. Initial, you don't know that they ever ask permission. It could be they just put it up. And now once it's up, mehechites, you have to rip it off the wall. But ki hamoin am efshar asu b'loy she'elas chacham. The fact that you see it up on the wall is not indicative that it's correct. Somebody paid a lot of money. He wanted his name on it, so he put it up on the wall. Now what? We're going to rip down the wall because he violated the halacha. So the fact that it's done does not mean it's correct, says the Churashai. Okay.
We're saying that we should put no additional chashivas to the Aser Sadibros than anything else in the Torah.
That's what it seems that we're saying right now. Yeah.
That's the crux of it.
Yeah, that's the...
Although the Goyim do.
Yeah.
The Goyim do, we know.
Good for them, right? But, but right now, it seems like you can't lane it, right? You can't say it b'tzibor, you can't put it into Berachos Krishma, and you can't display it. Yeah.
Can you even say it when we lane Yisro or the
You're allowed to, you're not necessarily giving it more chashivos. You lane Bereshis, you lane Noach, you lane Yisro, you lane Vaschana, and you lane V'zoi Sabracha. Oh, stand. That's an interesting subject. Standing. So it seems that it would come out that based on what we're saying, if you're not allowed to read it during Berachos Krishma, and you're not allowed to say it b'tzibor, and you can't display it, so are you allowed to stand? So it would seem, of course you can't, and therefore the Chidah says in L'David Emes, Siman Zayin, Im kol hatzibor oim debeis kriyas aser sadibros einoi nachayin. It's not correct. And if a few people do it, it's not a big deal if only a few people are doing the wrong thing. But for the tzibor to stand, it is incorrect.
They add a few extra psukim?
However, says the Chidah, I won't ignore the fact that the minhag in most shuls is to stand. However, if you want to know my opinion about it, it is not correct, says the Chidah, to stand for Aseres Hadibros. Well, then where does it come from to stand during Aseres Hadibros? It is brought down in many very credible Svarim on Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah. One of the most prominent Svarim on Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah is the Shar Ephraim, and he writes that, let's talk in general. Is one required to stand for Kriyas HaTorah? No, you're not obligated to stand for Kriyas HaTorah. It is not a halachic obligation. Although the Shulchan Aruch says the Marami Rothenburg would stand. It's midas chasidus to stand, but it's not required. You're allowed to sit. So then the Shafraim brings this down. You don't have to stand. There are those who are machmer mimidas chasidus. However, during Aser Sadibros, the minhag is to stand. And if the minhag in the shul is to stand, one may not sit and be different than the rest of the tzibur. So again, very nice the minhag is to stand, but it would seem to be incorrect to stand based on the fact that you're not allowed to say it, but tzibur, you're not allowed to say in the Berachos Krishma, and you're not allowed to display it. By the way, in the Siddur of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he also brings down the minhag is to stand, and the Rebbe Vadia and the Yichavadas, is there a Yichavadas here? There should be. Remember, somebody once donated it there. Shlomo, is there a Yichavadas here? There is. If you could get a Chilek Aleph. Rebbe Vadia brings down in the Yichavadas from the Shalmei Tzibor, who brings down from the Chemdas Yamim, that even though according to the Arizal, you don't stand during Kriyas HaTorah, nevertheless, on Shavuos you should stand. A dugma to Kabbalas HaTorah. Okay, so very interesting. We mentioned before that the Chidah and L'David Emes brings down that it's not correct to stand for the Aser Sadibros. However, we've mentioned many times, the Chidah wrote many, many Svarim, and in the Sefer Toiv Ayin, in Siman Yud Aleph, the Chidah again discusses the custom of standing for Aser Sadibros. He brings down that many Mekayimos, the minhag is to stand, thank you, during Yisroi and Shavuos and Parsha V'Schanan, and there are those who challenge this minhag based on what the Gemara says in many places, that they were mavatel, the recitation of the Aser Sadibros, during davening because of Tarumos Haminim. Well, says the Chidah, in his opinion, Tarumos Haminim should not apply to standing for the Aser Sadibros. Why? Says the Chidah, in the second paragraph on the 7th line, he says, let's get a grip over here, says the Chidah. First of all, last week you laned B'Shalach. This week you're laning Yisroi. Next week you're laning Mishpatim. So what are you afraid? People are going to say, the only Torah that was given me Sinai is Parshas Yisro, so then why did you waste your time coming to Shul last week? Why are you wasting your time coming to Shul the next week? It's not like you're only laning Yisro, you're laning the whole Torah, Keseder. Elamai, you're standing up, but to say that we're afraid people are going to say the only Torah are the Aser Sadibros, when they see that you're laning the Shabbos before, the Shabbos after, and even in Parshas Yisro, you're not just laning the Aser Sadibros, you're laning the first part of the Parsha, you're laning after the Aser Sadibros, and therefore, says the Chidah, there's no problem of Tarumos Haminim. And this minhag has already gotten traction and momentum for many, many years, and therefore, says the Chidah the following. Since the minhag is to follow this, and to stand, everyone is obligated to stand. And nobody could remain sitting. By doing so, you're sort of challenging. He says like this. He says the Chidah in the last paragraph. V'nira, d'meyacher shenagu ha'am kein lakum kulam aser sadibros. Since the minhag is for everyone to stand, nira shechayavim hakol amoid. It would seem that everyone's obligated to stand. Ve'in l'shem echad lishar yoshev. No one should remain sitting. Degam she'inu min adin lakum. Even though it's not min adin to stand up. Ata shenagu kol hakol. And now that everyone is noyeg to stand, nasa chiyuv ava alakov yimlav chasashon be'inei amay nir k'mezalza. Otherwise, if you're sitting, you look like you don't treat it with respect. Okay. So there's a very interesting tshuva on the Egois Moshe regarding whether it's permitted to stand during the Aser Sadibros. And the shayal of the question was none other than his son, Reb David Feinstein Shlita. And Reb David asked his father, Tata Leibin Achvilder Fregen, what is the halacha you ought to stand for the Aser Sadibros? And, says Rav Moshe, he says there are those who are mefakbek about standing based on the Gemara that says, Af begvulin roitz alasaskein ubitlam mibnei terumas haminim. And therefore it would seem that people may say that if we stand for the Aser Sadibros, the same chashash applies. Well, some want to answer, and this is the answer given by the Likutei Ma'arich. Likutei Ma'arich is a 3-volume work of halacha, that we have a very good reason to stand for the Aser Sadibros. What's the reason? The reason is because at Kabbalah Satorah, the pasuk says, "Vayamdu meirachak." They stood. So as a zecher to Kabbalah Satorah, there's a good reason to stand. They didn't have chairs. Party rental companies had not been, they didn't reach the midbar, and they had nowhere to sit. And the sand was very hot on that day, so what are they going to do? They had to stand. Well, says Rav Moshe, it's a bad reason. Why? Says Rav Moshe, I'm sure Chazal, when they wanted to institute, to say the Aser Sadibros every day in Birchas Krishma, they also had a good reason to do so. But they said it's not kedai, lest the minim say this is the only Torah. So says Rav Moshe, we see from here that good reasons are irrelevant. That reason, but ultimately what weighs out is the fact that we're worried that people are going to say this is the only Torah. So very nice, you have a nice reason to stand on Shavuos, but we should be worried that people are going to say Ein Torah Elazu. Says Rav Moshe, the answer that you, my dear son, are giving is a good answer. What answer did Rav David give? Rav David said that maybe in the olden days when people would stand for Aser Sadibros, it looked problematic. But nowadays, there's so many things we stand for. We stand for the Shira and Beshalach. We stand for the Shira on Shri Shal Pesach. I would add, we stand for the Chazak. So the fact that we stand for many, many intervals indicates that we're not worried. In other words, we're not worried people are going to say this is the only Torah because it's not the only thing we stand for. If it would be the only thing we stood for, then maybe we should be concerned. But nowadays that there are many, many things to stand for, it's not a problem. However, says Rav Moshe, your answer, Reb David, is a good answer, but I'm going to say better. I'm going to say it's not even a question to begin with. Meaning you're giving an answer, but I'm going to say it's not even a question. Why? So Moshe explains, first of all, I'm in number 15. I'm in paragraph Divrei HaMaschal Aval Lanias Daiti, beginning like the 6th line. Rav Moshe says Why did they say the Aseret HaDibros in the Beis HaMikdash? What was the purpose of it? So Rav Moshe quotes the Rambam in the Parsha HaMishnayis on Tamid, in the beginning of the 5th parak, that the Aseret HaDibros are Iker Hadas V'Reishisai. The Aseret HaDibros are the fundamentals of Emunah. Why were they not afraid in the Beis HaMikdash that people would say, this is the only Torah? Well, says Rav Moshe, because in the Beis HaMikdash you had Kohanim, Yirei Hashem, you had Leviim, you had Yisraelim b'ma'amadam, Kulam Yirei Hashem, you had the Sanhedrin there, you had the Lishkas Hagazos there, and if we would hear a word that the Goyim are taunting, oh, this is the only Torah, we would very quickly put it to rest with the authority of the Talmidei Chacham and the Kohanim, Leviim, and the Lishkas Hagazos and the Sanhedrin that were situated there. However, once you get beyond the confines of the Beis HaMikdash, when you have Amei Haaretz, without enough Talmidei Chachamim to defend the halacha, it's a chshash. However, says Rav Moshe, there's a klal gadol in Gezeros D'Rabbanan, Heicha de Gazru, Gazru, V'heicha de Loi Gazru, Loi Gazru. You cannot extrapolate and say, well, if the Chachamim said that outside the Beis HaMikdash you can't inject the Aseret HaDibros into the Berachas Kriya Shema, therefore you also can't stand during the recitation of the Aseret HaDibros on Shavuos. No. There's a klal. Ein ledamois milsa lemilsa. Heicha de Gazru, Gazru, V'heicha de Loi Gazru, Loi Gazru. You can't say, well, if the Chachamim said a certain decree on certain circumstances, we'll extrapolate and apply it to other cases. We don't know exactly why the Chachamim decided to be goyzer in that case, and we have no right to extend it to other situations. Therefore, says Rav Moshe, you can't say it publicly in shul during the Berachas Kriya Shema, but we never found that they said you cannot stand for the Aseret HaDibros, and therefore, lefizeh, says Rav Moshe, ein ledamois milsa lemilsa b'svaros, ein lechaboy ela mashenesa kvar v'lo lamelaf mizeh davar chadash, and therefore, says Rav Moshe, ein l'shanos min haminhag. Okay, and Rav Moshe concludes, Adarabba ladina also l'shanos min haminhag hatzibor, and Rav Moshe defends the practice of standing for the Aseret HaDibros. However, there's a big problem over here. Because this question was raised well before, by the way, and based on what Rav Moshe is saying, l'char, that would be a very strong heter to write the Aseret HaDibros on a plaque that's displayed for the tzibor. Because again, the Gemara says that they only disallowed the recitation of the Aseret HaDibros in the Berachas Kriya Shema. The Gemara does not say that they said you cannot display the Aseret HaDibros. Oh, but we'll make a kal v'chomer. If you can't lay it in the Berachas Kriya Shema, certainly you can't display it on the wall. You can't make kal v'chomers from enactments that we don't necessarily know the bottom line reason for. We applied the rule of Rav Moshe, Heicha de Gazru, Gazru, V'heicha de Loi Gazru, Loi Gazru, Ve'en ledamos milsa lemilsa. So while the Magen Avraham says it's precisely the same gezerah, perhaps you could make the case that the same way Rav Moshe says you could stand for the Aseret HaDibros, because that is not precisely what the Chachamim ruled out. By the same token, l'char, you could say that you'd be allowed to display the Aseret HaDibros, let's say on the stone Chumash, on the New Hebrew one, where they actually display the Jewish Aseret HaDibros, which are square. You could do that. You could even do it on the English one. I wouldn't recommend doing it rounded on the top, like some people do, because that has nothing to do with the dimensions of the luchas, which the Gemara in Bava Basra says were square. But nevertheless, l'chayra, according to Rav Moshe, it should come out that just because the Chachamim asered you to lay in the Aseret HaDibros in the Berachas Kriya Shema, it should be permitted to display it publicly on a kuntris miyuchad l'tzibor. Here's the big problem. The problem is that Rav Moshe was not the first to deal with this shaila. That this shaila is as old as the hills. In fact, the very first time that this shaila appears, you know who was asked the question? The Rambam himself. It's the Rambam. I didn't get to that Rambam. It's not in the Yad HaChazaka. It's not in the Parsha Mishnayos. Yeah, but if you look at number 31, we're going to skip to number 31 for a little bit. The Rambam in the Shas Teshuvas Pe'er Hadar and the Teshuvas Harambam Siman Mem Vav the Rambam was asked about this exact question. They asked the Rambam, Alamidas b'nei Adam be'ez kriyas aseres hadibros yesh echa min hachachamim shetziva bazeh. One of the chachamim commanded that we do this. V'yesh mishamanam bazeh. And there are those who refrain from this. V'hevi raya, from the fact that Chazal were mevatel, the aseres hadibros in the Berachos Kriya Shema, because of the minim, shahayu aimim. The minim would say that the aseres hadibros are more important than the rest of the Torah. And they said that anyone who stands during the aseres hadibros, we should scream at them. Because this is the ways of the minim, who believe that the aseres hadibros is more important than the rest of the Torah. And, says the Rambam quotes this opinion, that we know throughout Shas, whenever there's a practice which is contrary to the practice of the Chachamim, we go out of our way to shame it and to go the other direction. For example, the minhag was that the kohen who burned the para, we would make that kohen tameh. To l'hoitzimi liban shel tzedokim, who would say that the kohen has to be tahar. And says the Rambam, the questioner says to the Rambam, others wanted to say that no, you should stand, because Klal Yisrael at the time of the giving of the Torah were standing shenemar vayisyatzu b'tachtas ahar. And the others said back, no, vayisyatzu b'tachtas ahar was that they came out to greet HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not that we have to stand. And the questioner said, in Bavel they stand. No, they're not standing for Aseres HaDibros. They're standing because the Rav or the Rosh Mesivta gets the Aliyah, and therefore they stood in honor for the Rav going up to the Sefer Torah. But from there, it developed the bad practice of standing at the time of Kriyas HaTorah. So all of this information was presented to Maimonides, the Rambam. And the Rambam responded, this, that the Chacham mentioned, that you should sit during the Kriya, is true. And all of his rayos are rayos. And we don't have to add. And this is what should be done in every tzibur, that the minhag is to stand. You need to stop them from standing. Why? Because it's going to cause people to err in the fundamentals of emunah. People are going to begin to think that the only Torah is aseres hadibros. Everyone's doing it. Says the Rambam, really? Since when is everyone doing something a reason to do it? Says the Rambam, Haga ba'atzmecha. If you pass by a hospital and you see 500 sick people, should you then check yourself in the cardiac unit, and maybe you should ask the doctor to get you sick and inject you with a lethal illness because everyone in the hospital is sick? Says the Rambam, you'd be a shoita sheba'olam. No, just the opposite. Whatever you could do to get the guys out of the hospital, you should try to do that. Says the Rambam, same thing with Judaism. We don't care what people do. We care what the right thing is. If they're right, then you follow them. And if they're wrong, get them out of the hospital. You don't follow what the olam is doing, says the Rambam. The same way you don't check yourself into a hospital where people are sick, because that's where everyone seems to be. And therefore the Rambam says it is absolutely wrong to stand for this aseres hadibros. So here's the thing. Rav Moshe was a Pesach Hadar. But what about the Rambam? Rav Moshe was a Rishon. Can Rav Moshe argue on the Rambam? Well, comes Rav Avadia Yosef in the Teshuvas Chavadas, and Rav Avadia says, with all due respect to many of the great Poskei Doireinu, it seems that they did not have the Bekiyas and they did not see the Teshuvas Harambam. Says Rav Avadia, look at number 33. Rav Avadia Hoidaya and Shas Teshuvas Yaskel Avdi, he paskins and he defends the practice of standing. And his father of Shalom Hadaya also. Says Rav Avadia, Shneim loy zachru ba'esahi mitshuvas Harambam. They both forgot to mention the Teshuvas Harambam. And even though the Shas Teshuvas Yaskel Avdi and Chilek Zayin mentions the Teshuvas Harambam, he still disagrees. Says Rav Avadia b'mechilas k'vay tarasai ein dvarav mechuvarim lahalacha. We do not follow achronim who ignore the Rambam. V'lachein ha'ikr, says Rav Avadia, if you're in a shul where they stand, you have to throw tomatoes at them. You have to be moicha. They're violating the halacha. V'lachein ha'ikr b'zeh sheyesh limchos b'mi sha'oimed b'kriyas aseres hadibros. And certainly if they're Talmidei Chachamim sitting, and this Chevraman wants to stand because he thinks he's a besser mensch, doesn't he know you're now to be machmir in front of Talmidei Chachamim? Well, that's Rabbi Avadia speaks quite kindly here. And he says it even stronger, where he says in the Yechavadas, Yinei hadavar barar shechida ushar rishonim loiro tshuvas harambam. The chida, says Rabbi Avadia, and all the other achronim, they did not see the tshuvas harambam. Because, wow, what do you mean they didn't see it? It was in manuscript form in the times of chida. Ilu ro divrei harambam loyhoyum etzadim b'koch dater l'kam minhag. They never would have defended neged divrei harambam. Soif davar hoikar hu kedivrei Rabbeinu Harambam ve'in lozuz midvarav yamin usmail. Right, but since the Rif and the Rush don't comment, and all you have is the Rambam, avada we follow the Rambam. Nobody argues with the Rambam. No Rishonim argue with the Rambam. If the Rambam says halacha and none of the Rishonim argue, avada we follow the Rambams. And therefore says Rav Avadia, anyone who says otherwise, nelmu me'eneihem, the bekiyas in this subject. Nothing. The Shulchan Aruch does not say one word about whether you're allowed to stand or whether you're not allowed to stand during the Aseres HaDibros. Avad or not, it wasn't in print. Shulchan Aruch wasn't in print. Of course he didn't see it. And therefore, says Rav Avadia, this is not one of those things that if you're in a shul, you say, live and let live, this is America, you follow your Rav, I follow my Rav, you follow your minhag, I follow my minhag. No, there's no minhag. They're in the hospital, and you need to remove them and extricate people who stand from the Beis HaCholim. And you should be moicha. So the question is, what about Rav Moshe? Did Rav Moshe see the Teshuvas Harambam? So there are two things. There are two ways to go over here. Number one, it's well known, the Shita of Rav Moshe is you don't have to look in all the Svarim. Rav Moshe's Shita was, you look in the Shulchan Aruch and the Noisei Kelim, and a tshuva of the Rambam, which is not one of the main Svarim that were Nimsar, Midar Ladar, after all, it was a manuscript form. L'chayra Rav Moshe may say that we're not bound by a tshuva of the Rambam. If the Rambam would have wrote in the Yad HaChazaka, then we're bound by it. But the fact that the Rambam wrote this, and certainly Rav Moshe would not say he's as great as the Rambam, but it was not given over from generation to generation, and we're not bound by the Teshuvas Harambam. Although it would be difficult why Rav Moshe did not quote the Teshuvas Harambam. After all, this very question that Rav David Feinstein asked Rav Moshe was already addressed in the Teshuvas Harambam. If Rav Moshe wants, maybe he could say that even though the Teshuvas Harambam answers this, but this is a tshuva that was not given over from generation to generation, therefore we're not bound by it. So therefore we're going to take a different approach today. We're going to take the approach of Reb Chaim Brisker to try to defend the practice of, I would say, the vast majority of Ashkenazic Jewry from the Teshuvas Harambam. Raise your hand if you daven in an Ashkenaz shul and they sit for the Aseres HaDibros. I didn't think so. I'm not aware of any Ashkenazic shul that they sit for the Aseres HaDibros. The Sfardim, by the way, they absolutely sit for the Aseres HaDibros, and they're required to sit. The Rambam says you got to sit. Rav Avadia says you have to sit.
I'm pretty sure in the Ramesh shul is they don't sit. He insisted they sit.
Do Sfardim stand for laning? Sfardim, do they stand? They don't. They sit for laning. Sfardim sit for laning. Nobody stands. So, not even one guy. Not even one. You heard that? You heard it here first. Not even one guy in a Sephardic shul stands, except for the Balkari, stands for Aser Sadebros. And therefore, they certainly don't stand for the Aser. They don't stand for Lane. They don't stand for Aser Sadebros. So the question is, how do we, Jews of Ashkenazic descent, defend our custom from an open Shuvas Harambam who says you're not allowed to stand, and if you stand, we throw tomatoes at you, and not fresh tomatoes either. We throw old tomatoes at you. How do we defend our practice? Moirav Rabboisai, let's spend a few moments talking about the Aser Sadebros. Because, this whole Shaila is surrounded about the fact that people are going to say that the Aser Sadebros are more important than the rest of the Torah. Well, are they or are they not? They're not? So then why did they say it in the Beis HaMikdash? Is Aser Sadebros more important or is it not more important? Well, let's take a look. Let us take a look. Marv Rabboisai. We mentioned the Rambam says that they used to lane it in the Beis HaMikdash, the Aser Sadebros, because the Yisoidei Hadas V'Reishisai, the fundamentals of faith, are in the Aser Sadebros. Hafla V'Fela, the Medrash in Bamidbar Rabbah, number 16, says, on the words Malaya Ketores, that if you take the word Ketores, and you atbash the kuf, and you transform the kuf into a dalid, so then you get what number? Dalid, tes, reish, taf. 613. Why? Because Marav Rabboisai, do you know how many letters are in the Aseres HaDibros? 613 until you get to the letters Asher L'Reyacha. So you have 613 plus another 7. Says the Medrash, there's 613 letters in the Aseres HaDibros, and you have another 7 keneged the 7 days of creation. By the way, the Baal HaTurim in Parsha Yisro, number 17, points out that there are 620 letters in the Aseres HaDibros, keneged the 613 mitzvahs, and the 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanon, Keminyan, Keser, Torah. The 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. By the way, the Prima Godim in the Psicha Koilelas also brings down, based on the tradition of the Gemara Makos, Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, Darash Rabbi Simloi, there's 613 mitzvahs, Nemru L'Moshe. This is a well-known statement without any machlokes. And the Baal HaTurim brings down 620 letters, 613 keneged, the 613 mitzvahs, and 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. By the way, others have it a little differently. Instead of the six, the Baal HaTurim says 613 mitzvahs and 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Some say instead the seven mitzvahs midrabanan. So, for example, look at number 19. The Chsam Sofer in the Torah's Moshe, in Parshas Yisro, brings down there's 613 mitzvahs in the 613 letters in the Aseres HaDibros, keneged the 613 mitzvahs, plus Asher L'Reyacha. Who are your friends? The rabbis. The rabbis are your friends. So the 7 letters in Asher L'Reyacha correspond to the Sheva mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, and Asher L'Reyacha is Rashi Tevos. Aleph stands for Avelos, which is one of the Sheva mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Shin is Simchas Chasan V'Kala, and Reish is Rechitza Netilas Yadayim. Lamed is Lechem, which means Pasakum. Reish is Reshuyos, Eruv Chatzeres, and Shutufei Muvais. Ayin is Amalek Mikra Megillah, and Chaf are Kohanim, the Nes of Chanukah. So basically, you have various ways to go. You have 620 letters in the Aseres HaDibros, keneged the 613 mitzvahs. Zayin keneged either the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach or the Sheva mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. So that's pretty interesting, that somehow the Aseres HaDibros correspond to the whole Torah. Marv Rabboisai, when Moshe Rabbeinu saw that Klal Yisrael were worshipping the Egel, what did he do with the Luchais? He broke them. Why did he break them? Why did he break? He should have returned them and got his money back. Why did he break them? The answer is the Gemara in Shabbos said he made a Kal V'chomer. The Korban Pesach is one of the 613 mitzvahs, and the Torah says, Kol ben nechal lo yochal boy. The Torah And Klal Yisrael are mumarim al achas kama v'kama. They cannot get the Torah. So he should have ripped up the Torah. Why did he break the luchais? Apparently the luchais are somehow the whole Torah. I'll give you another Maramakam. Look at number 27. Eis luchais ha'even v'ha Torah v'ha mitzvah asher kasavti l'hoyroisam. Says Rashi, Kol sheish me'os v'shalosh esrei mitzvos b'chlal aseres hadibros hein. All 613 mitzvos are included in the aseres hadibros. In fact, Rav Sadia Gaon wrote a piyut where each dibur corresponds, each dibur contains, 61.3 mitzvos. Let me ask you a question. It says that the king has to sit on his throne, and he has to write Es Mishneh HaTorah Azois, and it should be with him his whole life. L'man yilmad v'yiras Hashem alaikav. Says Teshuvas. You're telling me he wrote a Sefer Torah that fit in his hand? How are you going to write a Sefer Torah that fit in the hand of the Melech? Says Teshuvas, V'shamati ki oisoi Sefer Torah hatoloi b'zroyoi loi haya kasavoi ki im aseres hadibrois. And since there's 613 letters in the Aseres HaDibros, it's called the Sefer Torah. So can I ask you a simple question? Is the Aseres HaDibros more important than the rest of the Torah? Or not more important than the rest of the Torah? We lane it in the Beis HaMikdash, obviously because it's more important. We don't lane it as a Beis HaMikdash because it's not more important. You can't have it on a plaque because we don't want people to say that's the only Torah. And yet, when Moshe broke the luchais, Moshe said, I'm just breaking the luchais because this is the whole Torah. So is it the whole Torah or is it not the whole Torah? Is it more important? Is it not more important? Is it the Yesodei Emunah? Is it not the Yesodei Emunah? What is the meaning of the Aseres HaDibros to Klal Yisrael? Does it have chashivos? Does it not have chashivos? The Rambam said, don't you dare lane up at Tzibor. Don't you dare stand for the Aseres HaDibros. So then let me ask you a question. The Rambam didn't say don't stand because it's not more important. The Rambam said don't stand because we don't want people to say this is the only Torah. So why were they standing in the first place? Mar v'Rabosai, there are two traps with which you could lane the Aseres HaDibros. There's something called the Tam Elyon, and there's something called the Tam Tachton. For instance, what's the Tam Tachton? Loi sir tzach v'loi sinaf loi signoiv. Can I have a Chumash? Yeah. On the Kunshas Miyuchad L'Tzibur, they don't have the trap, right? So, let's go to Parshas V'aschanan, which is a very important parsha, because my bar mitzvah parsha. I didn't say Parsha V'aschanan is not coming up. Okay, you ready? Listen carefully. In the Tam Elyon, it says like this. In the Tam Tachton, it says like this. Loi sir tzach, v'loi sin af, v'loi signoiv, v'loi sa'anev re'acha eitshav. And in the Tam Tachton, it's Loi tirtzach, Loi tirtzach, v'loi tinaf, v'loi tignoiv. Why in the Tam Tachton is it sir tzach, and then the Tam Elyon it's Loi tirtzach? Very simply. What does it depend on? So it depends on the following. There are certain letters in the Hebrew alphabet that are called Beged Kefes. Beged Kefes means a Beis, a Gimel, a Daled, a Kaf, a Pei, and a Taf can have a dagesh in it, and should have a dagesh in it. So the letter Taf should normally have a dagesh in it. So it should be Loi Tirtzach. But there's a rule that whenever a Beged Kefes letter, a letter with a dagesh, is preceded by a vowel, for example, an aleph, it drops the next letter that has a dagesh, drops the vowel. And therefore it should be loy sir tzach, like in the tam tachtoin. So why in the tam elyon is it loy tir tzach? The answer is there's another rule. Because in the tam tachtoin, the loy is followed by a tipcha. A tipcha is a pause. Loy, pause, stop, and if you don't, according to Mishnah Berurah Machzir and Oisai, tir tzach. Many Balei Kriya don't realize that when you lane and there's a tipcha, you must pause. And if you don't pause, then l'charchila, you're not doing a good job. Asher yisa'eh shemoy lashav. You have to know to pause there. If you don't pause, then you're running over a trup, which is a melech. So just listen carefully. So in the tam tachtoin, it's loy sir tzach, because since there's no tipcha after the word loy, so the word loy and sir tzach go together. The aleph causes the taf to drop the dagesh, and it's loy sir tzach. But in the tam elyon, there's a tipcha after the word loy. So even though the aleph precedes the taf, but there's a pause after the loy, and therefore the loy and the tirtzach are not connected, and therefore it's loy tirtzach. Fine. What is the fundamental difference between the tam elyon and the tam tachton? Very simple. The tam tachton is how you read psukim. Anoichi Adonai Elohecha asher oitzeisicham eretz mitzrayim beis avodim. It's the end of the pasuk. Lo yiyelecha Elohim acherim al panoi. End of the pasuk. Lo yisas elecha fesel kol tmuna asher b'shamayim imav asher b'aretz mitachas asher b'mayim mitachas haaretz. So in the first two dibros, you have many psukim. Or in Shabbos, Shamoyer, Siyam Shabbos l'kadoshai, kasher tzivchadin elehecha, shejes yamim tavoid v'yasiso komachtecha. Even though it's all Shabbos, we break it up into psukim. The Tam Tachton is breaking them up into psukim. The Tam Elyon says we're not looking at psukim now; we're looking at dibros. So while there are many psukim in Shabbos, in the Tam Elyon it's all one long pasuk. Shamoyer es yayim Shabbos l'kadoshai. The whole Shabbos is one long pasuk because the Tam Elyon is breaking them up into dibros. Loi tirtzach. That's a dibur. It's not a pasuk. The pasuk has in it loi tirtzach, loi sinaf, loi tignoiv. But as a dibur, it stands by itself. So the difference between the Tam Tachton and the Tam Elyon is the Tam Tachton are psukim, and the Tam Elyon are aseres hadibros. Morav Rabbi, are the Aseres HaDibros more important than the rest of the Torah? And the answer is, it depends. As psukim, they are not more important than any other pasuk. Anoichi Hashem Elokecha has no more kedusha as a pasuk than the pasuk V'achas Loitan Timna, than Uvnei Dan Chushim. Every word of Torah has equal kedusha. Every pasuk in Chumash has equal kedusha. And therefore, as a Tam Tachton, it is no more important than the rest of the Torah. But as a dibur, as a seres hadibros, it has more chashivas. More chashivas in what way? In the following way. That it has chashivas, that it's representative of kol HaTorah kula. As a pasuk, it has no more chashivas. As a dibur, says Reb Sadia Goin, each one of the seres hadibros represents 70, 60 mitzvahs. As Tam Tachton, it's not any more chashuv. As Tam Elyon, it is more chashuv. Wow. So comes the Sefer Harei Kedem, and he quotes Rav Yasher Bar Soloveitchik, who, l'chayra, is saying this over from Reb Chaim Brisker, and I heard from reliable sources that this is already mi beis medrasha of the Grach, Reb Chaim. I heard this from B'Shem Reb Chaim, and Reb Chaim said the following. Look through the Yad HaChazaka. The Rambam does not talk and mention anything about Tam Tachton and Tam Elyon. You know why? Because the Shita of the Rambam was you always lane the Tam Tachton. You always lane psukim like psukim, whether it's Yisroi, Vaschanan, or Shavuos. So if you always lay in the Aseres HaDibros as psukim, memela, it is usher to stand for the Aseres HaDibros, because to give more chashivos to psukim of the Aseres HaDibros more than any other psukim, you're not allowed to do that. And taka, if you're in a shul that they lay in the Aseres HaDibros with tam tachdoin, and people stand, you throw old rotten tomatoes at them. And we're maskim to the Rambam, and Ashkenazim are agreed to the Rambam that you're not allowed to stand for the Aseres HaDibros if it's being lain with tam tachdoin. And on Parshas Yisro and Parshas Vaschanan, many achroinim paskin, they have to lay in the tam tachdoin. And in such a shul, you get out your old tomatoes and you throw it at anybody who stands for Aseres HaDibros. That's the psak of the Rambam. Nobody would argue. Rav Moshe would never argue on the Rambam. But the Bir Halacha brings down that different minhagim. The minhagim is that some are noyeg. By the way, it's good to know that when you're being maver sedra, you always lay in the tam tachtain. However, on Shavuos, the minhag is to lay in the tam elyon. Because on Shavuos, says Reb Chaim, the Kriyas HaTorah has two dimensions to it. Every Kriyas HaTorah is limud HaTorah. However, the Kriyas HaTorah of Shavuos has another dimension. And what is it? It's Zecher L'Maimed Har Sinai. And the best way to memorialize Har Sinai is to read the Torah the way the Torah was given on Har Sinai, and that is, it was given as Aseres HaDibros, and therefore to lay it b'tam elyon. And therefore the Rambam would be maskim that if you lay the Torah b'tam elyon, of course you're allowed to stand, because you're not giving more chashivas to these psukim over other psukim, you're giving chashivas to them as dibros, and as dibros they have a representative quality that gives them a advantage over the rest of the Torah. Now, the Bir Halacha brings down that Parshas Yisro and Parshas Vaschanan, you should lay in b'tam tachdoin. However, says the Bir Halacha, yesh nayagin likrois b'tzibur la'olam b'tam elyon. Lamaisa, the minhag ha'olam, is to lay the tam elyon whenever you lay the Aseres HaDibros b'tzibur, be it Shavuos, be it Yisro, and be it Vaschanan. And therefore, for those who lay in b'tam elyon, you're not violating the Teshuvas Harambam by standing, because the Rambam was speaking in the world of the tam tach. Now the Sfardim, I'm not sure which trop they lay in. They lay in the tam elyon, and they feel the Rambam would say, it doesn't matter, loy plug, you're not allowed to stand for the Aseres HaDibros. But to say that we Ashkenazim are violating or in contrast to this distinction to the Teshuvas Harambam by standing, we have, a lumdish way out of it, and that is, we could say the Rambam was referring specifically to the tam tachdoin. But we who lay in the tam elyon, we are entitled to stand and follow the custom of Amida for the Aseres HaDibros. Shkoyach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.